Ford, famous automobile company which is in the top 5 most successful automobile companies in the world. But what lays behind this name? What is its origin? Who was the creator and what was his purpose? A person who didn't agree with many in order to preserve his ideology. A person whose revolutionary idea was aimed at improving lives of ordinary people. A person whose name known in the whole world. Henry Ford, a person who changed America. Famed automobile manufacturer Henry Ford was born on July 30th, 1863, on the farm to William and Mary Ford in Spring Wells Township, Michigan, located 9 miles outside of Detroit. When Henry was 12, his mother died during childbirth. For the rest of his life, Henry tried to live his life as he believed his mother would have wanted, often citing lessons she had taught him before her death. Although close to his mother, Henry had a strained relationship with his father. While his father hoped Henry would someday take over the family farm, Henry preferred to tinker. When Ford was 15 years old, his father gifted him a pocket watch, which the young boy promptly took apart and reassembled. Friends and neighbors were impressed and requested that he fix their timepieces too. In fact, Henry was the eldest son of a caring, successful Michigan farm couple. His parents expected older children to work alongside them on the land. But when Henry found the work tedious and began obsessing over the machines that might make the farm life easier, his parents indulged him. They allowed him to neglect his chores and set up a workbench for him in the kitchen.
Not only would he take apart wristwatches and put them back together, but he would study every machine he saw.
Since young manhood, if not childhood, Henry Ford had felt a certain sense of destiny, that he was slated to do important things. He liked to picture himself to others as a kind of heroic individual who climbed to success against the odds.
Henry's father, William Ford, understood that his son longed to learn more about machinery. When Henry turned 16, William arranged for him to stay with his aunt in Detroit, and even found Henry a job. On a cold day in December, Henry walked 9 miles from his family farm to the city. There, he would reinvent himself. For more than a decade, Ford worked long hours in one shop after another, forging a career as an export machinist. During the winters, Henry stayed on his father's farm, diligently working on building a lighter steam engine. At this time, Henry met Clara Bryant. When they married, Henry's father gave him a large piece of land, on which Henry built a small house, a sawmill, and a shop to tinker in. Henry gave up farm life for good when he and Clara moved back to Detroit, so that Henry could learn more about electricity by working at the Edison Illuminating Company. By the time he was 31, he was chief engineer at the Edison Illuminating Company, the pioneer in providing electricity to American cities. As exciting as Edison was, Ford's passion lay elsewhere.
The notion of horseless carriage was in the air. And he and all of his buddies, they just devoured magazines and newspaper articles. And I think Ford just soaked that up.
Transportation in America was terrible once you got away from the railroads. Terrible. It was an enormous burden. I mean, if you're living on the farm, getting around on land is one of the biggest problems people have.
At the dawn of the automobile industry in the 1890s, most people saw the car as the luxury item for the wealthy. Ford had a different vision. he never forgot his feelings of isolation living on a farm, and imagined that others shared his longing for greater mobility. If he could build a reliable horseless carriage, Ford believed, he could change people's life.
He wanted to really change the tenor of his times. He is going to transform the world by building a type of cheap car that everybody could have.
On June 4, 1896, Henry Ford, at the age 32, completed his first successful horseless carriage, which he called the quadricycle. The quadricycle had a lot of technical issues, the false starts, the wrong turns, but none of it mattered when in one night Ford drove his first horseless carriage on the streets of Detroit. The quadricycle, as Ford adopted, had 28-inch bicycle wheels, a top speed of 20 miles per hour, and no brakes. It couldn't go in reverse and was prone to overheating. But still, it was something to be proud of. Wherever he went, the quadricycle drew crowds of curious bystanders. Soon, he attracted the attention of more than a dozen of Detroit's most prominent leaders, including a mayor himself, all eager to invest in Ford and his machine.
There's some people, when they walk into a room, you notice them. He has an inner self-confidence. That means the way he carries himself, you're going to notice it.
Within 3 years of the inaugural drive, Ford had quit his engineering job. In a brick building on Cass Avenue in Detroit, he assembled a team of 13. The Detroit Automobile Company, incorporated on August 5, 1899, was one of the first car manufacturing firms in the city, but it wouldn't be the last. The automobile industry was exploding. 57 other firms were founded the same year. Within 2 years, there would be more than 100.
There are all kinds of people that Henry Ford knows that are tinkering and playing and trying to, produce a prototype. All men, all interested in machines, but all without a big picture view of what this could become.
A company spokesman hailed Ford's first model as near perfect. But when it went on sale, it was more like a horse delivery wagon without a horse. It was high-sided, heavy, and due to problems with an ignition and carburetor, rarely ran for more than a few minutes at a time. His backers pushed for a new luxury model that was more reliable. But Ford stalled, determined to work out engine and design problems before building another car.
He would move parts around, and then he would test it, and then he would go back and move some more parts. There's a kind of both breadth of vision in that kind of activity, but there's also a kind of monomaniacal focus. No detail is too small, but the overall objective, make the thing better, is never lost sight of.
As his investors increased the pressure, Ford bought himself time by having his employees to make parts for a vehicle that he never planned to build. Meanwhile, he continued to experiment.
His investors want to make an expensive car to sell to wealthy people. Ford disagrees fundamentally. He wants to create a car for the people.
He's trying to perfect an invention. In order to keep doing the trial runs and get it better, it's going to take a lot of capital to keep testing.
Finally realizing they're being duped, his backers pulled the plug. In the 3 years that the fledgling car industry had existed in America, Henry Ford had managed to squander his chance to be part of it. And he knew exactly who to blame: his investors. "From here in," Ford declared, "my shop is always gonna be my shop. I'm not going to have a lot of rich people tell me what to do."
He hated the people that invested in him, loathed them. These were the scum of America to Henry Ford. These are the people that looked down on the slang of the farm and the kinfolk of his that had worked the land for generations. He did not like these people.
from the beginning, there seemed to have been two strands in American car making. There were the people who were making horseless carriages for the rich, loading them down, making them heavy and luxurious. And then there was Henry Ford, who had this idea that a car should be able to go along the rutted tracks. It should be able to drive across a plowed field. A farmer should be able to use it and take a wheel off it and fix a chain to it and cut some trees down or husk some corn. That was all he was interested in from the start.
Henry Ford brought this vision into the shop and tinkered until he came up with his ideal automobile, the Model T.
The Model T was simple, reliable for its day. It was very, very rugged. It was fairly high off the ground, had good ground clearance, which sounds like an odd thing to use in its advantage, but in the days when roads were often wagon ruts, ground clearance was very important. And it was also cheap.
The Model T was an astounding success. It went on sale in October 1908, and within a few months, Ford was forced to announce that the company couldn't accept new orders. The factory was already swamped, months behind. But it left him with a problem: how to build a production to satisfy the man. At the time, craftsmen building cars at stationary workbenches could produce 25 Model Ts a day. But 25 weren't enough. So Henry Ford and his engineers came up with a revolutionary idea: the moving assembly line. August 1913. A chassis was put in motion at Ford's Highland Park plant. It moved past the line of carefully positioned men and components. At peak efficiency, the old system had spit out a finished T in 12.5 man-hours. With the chassis in motion, that time dropped to less than a half that. A year it took just 93 minutes to make a car. With production getting more and more efficient, Ford was able to cut hundreds of dollars off the price of his car. Cutting prices enabled Ford to achieve what he claimed were his two aims in life: to bring the pleasures of the automobile to as many people as possible, and to provide a large number of high-paying jobs to his workers. But there was a factor in equation that he haven't yet considered.
If you worked on that line, you sweated. You really worked hard. You're kind of a slave to that line. And you went to bed at night and you dreamed about working. You worked all night long in your dreams.
The problem was that there is 1,000 men for every 100 jobs that company hoped to fill. And hiring and training men cost money. Something had to be done. And again, Ford came up with an answer: the $5 a day. Henry Ford would pay to his workers more than twice the going rate. It was front-page news across the country. Workers flocked to the gates of Ford Motor Company. But Ford was also genuinely trying to improve the lives of his workers. On the strength of this public approval, Ford began to feel that he should speak out on other issues. And with Europe exploding in a war, he tried international politics. He would give everything he possessed to stop the war. The peace delegation was far from united around the cause. By the time the ship was docked in Norway, Ford was deeply discouraged. He left for the States just a few days after landing. Back home, though, Ford found himself as a hero to the common man. Maybe it had been foolish to think that he could end the war, but even his critics admitted that at least he had tried. When America did enter the war, Henry Ford stood by his country. With American boys leaving home, Ford opened his company's facilities for the government. The government, and the country for that matter, considered Henry Ford capable of producing miracles. Model Ts served as ambulances and staff cars. And with Allied shipping in the North Atlantic plagued by German submarines, the Navy turned to Ford to build the Eagle boat, a sub-chaser. With the war over, Ford continued his intensive work. But still, while he was working, he was able to find the time which he could spend for his family. The tough, shrewd man that ran Ford Motor Company was much different man at home with the family.
As I remember my great-grandfather, he was very sort of tall and thin, and he had the most incredibly hard handshake. And I remember that because each time I went there, he always shook my hand first and then gave me a kiss hello. And I always used to think, oh my God, he's broken my bones. He was very soft as far as being around children was concerned. I mean, he wasn't, don't do this, don't do that kind of thing. I think he enjoyed it when we did come around to play.
Henry Ford was a dreamer. Once the old stockholders had been bought out, he was free to lead Ford Motor Company anywhere his imagination took him, and that was often a long way from automaking. He also produced the Fordson tractor. He tried to bring aviation to everyone's driveway with a single-passenger Flavor plane. Henry Ford operated an early air-mail route, the first regularly scheduled passenger flights, here promoted by the Our Gang Kids. He set up and founded the several experimental schools. And at the Edison Institute at Greenfield Village, Ford's museum in restored American Town, he created a tribute to the spirit of innovation, honoring such greats as his friend, Thomas Edison. But the grandest of Henry Ford's dream was the Rouge, a plant that was itself a giant machine. And in its time it was the greatest industrial complex on Earth. It is still today an industrial wonder, a lasting tribute to the power of Henry Ford's dreams and his incredible determination. About the time that the first blast furnaces at the Rouge were being fired, Henry Ford again offered the world his thinking. But this time his thinking was stated by anti-Semitism.
Anti-Semitism was very common in the farm communities of the Midwest at the end of the last century. It went with mistrust of the East, of the banking system, all sorts of things like this. And Henry Ford's prejudices were those of an ordinary Midwest farmer. The tragedy of it was that he had the money and the conceit to put his ideas on paper and actually publish his own magazine, which spread it all around America and of course made him a laughingstock.
Through the Dearborn Independent, Ford blamed the Jewish people for everything from World War to shirt skirts, cheap movies, and jazz music. It wasn't until he faced a libel suit, public disapproval, and the continued pleas of friends that Henry Ford tendered an apology. But there are those who doubted the sincerity of that apology. In July 1938, Ford accepted Germany's Grand Cross, the highest honor the Third Reich could bestow on a foreigner. As the 20s wear on, Rouge workers continued to pump out hundreds of thousands of Model Ts. Meanwhile, Ford began to find himself falling behind the times. He liked older America. He was never comfortable in the modern world that he had helped to shape. His son Edsel, by this time second in command at Ford, was from another generation entirely. He liked jazz music, contemporary art, and an occasional cocktail. Henry Ford was much different. He preferred bird watching and all-time country dancing. At this rare footage, Ford demonstrates how far he'd go to popularize those old steps. While Henry Ford was dancing, the marketplace was changing. And finally, Ford Motor Company realized that they have a serious competitor.
The car that really did in the Model T was the Chevrolet. General Motors recognized fairly early what Edsel Ford had recognized, that once the market was, the actual need for automobiles was satisfied, you needed a way to continue to convince people to buy new cars, even if they didn't really need one, even if their old one wasn't worn out. One of the ways you do that is you change the way cars look every year. You make the car look more pleasing.
In May 1937, the Model T era came to a close. But Henry Ford and his son were optimistic. With Edsel's idea to create a more attractive and comfortable car, and with Ford's engineering talent, they came up with the new automobile, the Model A.
They've been asking us what we think of the coming year. All I can say is that we feel pretty good about the outlook.
In 1931, the Depression cut off the Ford. After 3 years in the market, Model A sales failed dramatically. And after that, Ford could never come back at the dominating positions in the market. But here he joined the good friends Thomas Edison and Harvey Firestone in an historic radio broadcast offering their wisdom on the Depression.
If a young man makes up his mind to work, there's no limit to what he can do. But if he makes up his mind to go at it without the idea of work, he hasn't much chance. He must study and work, and he must go back in any art as far as he can, just dig up the very beginning, and he must, the more he goes back, the further he will be able to see ahead.
Soon, the Ford Motor Company was have to cut the production and send workers home. Those who stayed found their wages cut. Unemployment left people without a work for more than 6 months. Therefore, workers decided to organize protest, which rapidly turned to a violent unrest. At the end, 4 young marchers lay dead. 5th died later. Soon after, Henry Ford will have to face another tragedy. His son, Edsel Ford, died. The number of illnesses contributed to his death: stomach cancer, liver cancer, and, in the last irony, undulant fever, the result of drinking unpasteurized milk from his father's dairy. Henry Ford was never the same after his son's death. With his active role in the company behind, Henry Ford began to disconnect from the world by leaving control over his business to his grandson, Henry Ford II. Stores of energy that had sustained him well into his 70s had been spent. On an April evening in 1947, Henry Ford laid his head on his wife's shoulder and drifted away. The cause of death was cerebral hemorrhage. He was 83. Tens of thousands of people lined up to view Henry Ford's body as it lay in state. Some factories closed, others shut down in a moment of silence. In all, it estimated close to 7 million workers who were involved in some demonstrations of sympathy for the man who had changed their lives. Henry Ford's business was run by the family for generations and generations, and Ford Motor Company continued its work, and during the century and to now, it's improving the automobiles, thereby keeping what Henry Ford once started. But at this time, Detroit motorists were asked to come to a complete stop at the time the automaker's body was being lowered into the ground. For that second, when the automobiles came to a complete stop, Detroit was returned to the way Henry Ford had found it. Henry Ford was an idealistic, revolutionary progressivist whose purpose was to improve the life of the common man. Even if there were failures in his life, he never despaired and always went ahead. Thereby, he became a model man for many.